Hey everybody and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jesse Laval, and if you clicked this video, you're probably a beginning photographer. So one, I want to congratulate you on getting into photography. It's one of the best hobbies in the world. And two, I want to make sure that you realize that while this can be some intimidating information, it's really not that complicated. I'm going to do my best to try to break this down in very simple terms so that you can understand them. Now today we're going to be going over just shutter speed, which is one element of the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is nothing more than a fancy term for the three elements that you can manipulate with your camera to create an exposure or create an image that you take with your camera. Now those three things are the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Now I've made a video earlier about the aperture. Today we're going to be covering just the shutter speed. Now one video that I came across early on when I was into photography that made a lot of sense to me was to think about your shutter as if it was a curtain on a stage. So the curtains draw in together and they meet in the center. They close from left to right. The difference between the curtains on your camera and the curtains on a stage are the curtains come from top to bottom when we take a picture on our sensor. So one curtain comes from the top, one curtain comes from the bottom, and they meet in the center. Now the shutter speed is nothing more than the measurement of time that those shutters take to actually snap that image. So when you take a longer or slower shutter speed, that's going to open those curtains and allow more time for the sensor to capture the light. Now the problem with a longer exposure is that you're giving the subject more time to move. And if that subject does move, it's going to cross pixels on your sensor. This is going to create motion blur, which is most of the time an undesirable effect. So that's where you start to run into thinking about, if the subject is going to be moving, I'm going to need higher shutter speed. So when shooting something like a bird in flight, or say a dog running, you're going to want to use higher shutter speed, something like 1/800th of a second, or 1/4000th of a second. Now the thing about that is, now remember, these curtains are now closing at 1/4000th of a second, very, very fast, which means your sensor is going to be exposed to the light for a very short duration of time, which means it's not going to get a lot of light. This is why when you use higher shutter speeds, you get less light onto your sensor, and you start to need to use higher ISO values to compensate for that. So that's one thing that you want to understand, is that the shutter speed is going to affect two main things that you need to worry about. One, the amount of motion blur, or lack thereof, depending on what you're going for, but also the amount of light that's going to get onto your sensor. While using a higher shutter speed will lead to less motion blur, or freezing motion, it will also lead to a lower amount of light getting onto your sensor, which will mean it will require a higher ISO value, leading to more noise in your image. And these are the things that you need to start to think about, because that's what we're talking about when we talk about the exposure triangle. It's nothing more than just the physics of light, and how when you change one element of it, there's always going to be a consequence, and then you'll have to sacrifice another element of that exposure triangle to balance it. And that's the game that we're playing as photographers. If I'm shooting something that's in motion, I need higher shutter speeds to freeze motion, but then I'm also going to need higher ISO values to compensate for that lower light that I'll be capturing, because my curtains are not allowing my sensor to get as much light onto it. Now there are creative times that you want to have longer exposures and you want to actually convey the motion. So if you're shooting something like a waterfall and you want to have motion blur in that image, then what you would do is actually use a slower shutter speed, something like maybe 2 seconds or 3 seconds. Now that's a very long exposure time. That means that your curtains are going to open up for a full 3 seconds, exposing your sensor to a full 3 seconds of light. Now that's a very long time, and you're going to get motion blur. When the water moves, you're going to see that look like that really pretty silky motion blur that you see in a lot of long exposure waterfall photography that you've seen before. Now most of the time motion blur is an undesirable effect, and a lot of times you're really trying to mitigate that. If you're shooting something like a bird in flight or something fast, then you're going to be trying to use higher shutter speeds to get less motion blur, because this is going to make your subject seem more in sharp focus. If you don't, you'll get motion blur, it'll look blurry, it won't look sharp. But there are creative times that you want to use what are known as long exposure times that will convey motion blur. If you're shooting something like a plane in flight, You still want to use a decently high shutter speed because you want to freeze the motion of the actual subject, but if you use too high of a shutter speed, you'll freeze the motion of the props, and then it looks really kind of fake or like it's frozen in time. A lot of photographers like to have the motion blur of the props there while still freezing the motion of the actual subject. So that's an instance where you would want to think about not using too high of a shutter speed, but you want to also use a decently high shutter speed to freeze the main subject. An even more straightforward example of that would be shooting a waterfall, where a lot of times people will opt to use long exposures. This is where you'll set your exposure time to over a second, sometimes 3 seconds, sometimes 6 seconds. It depends on how much light is in the actual scene, but what you will get there is you can get the rest of the scene in nice sharp focus as long as nothing else is moving and you're using a tripod so that your camera gets no motion. But you will get the motion blur from the water. And this is where you'll see that silky kind of really beautiful type of photography that you've probably seen and may have not even realized that they were long exposures. And those are examples of times that you want to convey motion, and you'll use your shutter speeds to do that. But the main thing as a beginning photographer that's really important for you to understand is that your shutter speed is going to affect two main things when you're taking an image. One, it's going to affect how much motion blur is going to be happening in that image. So if you're shooting something that's moving, like say a dog running across a field, or say some type of bird in flight, anything that's moving in general, you need higher shutter speeds. If you can get away with something that's more of a still image, you can back your shutter speeds off. Now, like I said, there's things that you want to think about there. The higher the shutter speed, the less light that gets onto our sensor, because our curtains are not opening for as long. So our sensor only gets, let's say, 1/200th of a second as opposed to 1/100th of a second. So if that sensor is exposed to light for only half the amount of time, it's going to need twice the amount of ISO value to get the same amount of an exposure there. So these are things that you need to start to contemplate and start to understand in depth, so that way you can start to really take control of your camera. Remember, the ultimate goal here is going to be to get you guys to shoot in manual mode. You want to be able to really take control of the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. And I'm not saying that that needs to be done all the time, but I am saying that it is important that you at least have the ability to do that. You need to have an in-depth understanding of these three elements and how they work together to create an exposure. As you do that, you're going to be able to have full control over the creative elements of your images. You're going to be able to create blurry backgrounds. You're going to be able to create frozen motion if you want. If you want to shoot something like a hummingbird in flight, this is going to be crucial for you to understand. If you want to be able to shoot something like stars or astrophotography, that's where you're going to start getting into long exposure photography. So understanding how your shutter speed works, why it affects the images the way that it does, are very, very important for you to start to contemplate and understand. Anyway, guys, I hope that this video helped you out a little bit. If it did, go below, subscribe, click that notification bell, and I'll see you on my next video.